In the past few years, genealogy testing has brought us the real identities of the 1981 Harris County Jane and John Does, the boy in the box, and the Lady of the Dunes, some of the true crime community's most baffling cases. However, as well as helping to identify the victims, such testing has also become a great tool for leading investigators to the perpetrator. Join us for this episode as we examine 4 decades-old cold cases that were finally solved. Mary Schlais. The body of 25-year-old Mary Schlais was discovered at an intersection in the township of Spring Brook, Wisconsin on February 15, 1974. She had been stabbed to death while she was hitchhiking from Minneapolis to Chicago for an art show. Little is known about the original investigation into Mary's murder, but according to ABC News, for decades tips came in, and leads were hunted down and thoroughly investigated before being ruled out. Multiple law enforcement agencies participated in the interviews of dozens of witnesses and potential suspects, and DNA was pulled from crime scene evidence in the latter years when the technology was available to do so. But despite all of that, Mary's case went unsolved. Investigators believed they were close to finding answers in 2009 when they identified Randall Woodfield, the I-5 killer, as a suspect. Though he matched a witness description and was traveling between Portland and Green Bay at the time, he was never concretely connected to the case, and thus never charged. One of the main pieces of evidence from the scene was a stocking cap from which hairs had been collected. While a DNA profile had been built, it did not match anyone in the police database. So in 2024, investigators turned to genealogy testing, which they hoped would help them hone in on one particular suspect. Investigators joined forces with Ramapo College in New Jersey, which specializes in such testing, and after interviewing relatives and collecting DNA evidence, it was announced that 84-year-old John Miller was the perpetrator of the crime. Miller, who lived in Minnesota, initially denied knowing anything about Mary or her death when approached by investigators. However, when confronted with the DNA evidence, the elderly man revealed that he'd picked Mary up while she was hitchhiking and had asked her for sexual contact in exchange for the ride. When she turned him down, he stated that he grabbed the knife he had stowed in his vehicle and stabbed her in the back. Investigators have noted that Mary had been stabbed numerous times and suffered extensive defensive wounds on her hands. Miller claimed that after the murder, he pulled off the highway and attempted to stash her body in a snowbank. However, he became frightened when a car drove by and abandoned his attempts to hide her and fled the scene. He confessed to being the owner of the stocking cap. After his admission, he was held at Steele County Jail and charged with 1 count of first-degree murder. As of November 2024, he is awaiting extradition to Wisconsin. The case is still ongoing. Esther Gonzalez. 17-year-old Esther Gonzalez was last seen on February 9, 1979, when she left the home she shared with her parents in the city of Beaumont, California, to walk to her sister's place. She never reached her sister's residence and never returned home either. Esther was missing for less than 24 hours when on February 10th, an anonymous man contacted authorities to let them know that a body had been discovered in the snow near Highway 243. Authorities promptly arrived at the scene, where the body was identified as Esther's. Her death had been violent. She had been sexually assaulted and bludgeoned to death. About a week later, investigators were able to determine that the anonymous tipster, who they had at one point described as argumentative, was Louis Randolph "Randy" Williams. Williams had declined to share details of what he was doing in the area and how he had stumbled across Esther's body when he contacted the police, and after his identification, he was questioned and asked to take a polygraph test, to which he agreed. Williamson passed the polygraph, but his DNA was never taken and tested since the technology didn't exist at the time. The polygraph test alone was enough for investigators to unofficially clear him of the crime, though they maintained that he was still a suspect in the case. In the years since Esther's murder, detectives have periodically revisited the case and re-examined the evidence. A semen sample taken from Esther's body was uploaded to the DNA database, but no matches were found. 4.5 decades passed before the case saw any real movement. In November of 2024, authorities made a surprise announcement when they confirmed that Williams was, in fact, Esther's killer. Since Williams died in 2014, he cannot be tried in her case, but at his autopsy, a blood sample had been taken and stored away. Authorities in Florida, where he'd died, agreed to send the sample to California so that investigators could test it against the DNA found at the crime scene. It proved to be a perfect match. Fortunately, there are lots of members of the Gonzalez family still alive who were able to see some kind of closure in the case. Esther's sister, Elizabeth, who is now 64, told CNN, "We are very happy that we finally have closure. We are happy about it, but since the guy has died, a little sad that he won't spend any time for her murder." Elizabeth recalled that she was very close with her sister, as they were only 1 year apart in age. She described Esther as funny, but shy and mild-mannered. She had 5 other siblings aside from Elizabeth. Her oldest brother, Eddie, thanked investigators in a Facebook post for their persistence. Little information has been released about Williams, but investigators are interested to know more about Esther's case, and whether or not Williams is connected to other cases. If you have any information about either of these topics, you can contact authorities at coldcaseunit@rivcoda.org. Kathy Halle. 19-year-old Kathy Halle was last seen on March 29, 1979, when she left her apartment to pick up her sister from Northgate Shopping Center in North Aurora, Illinois. She never arrived at the center, and her family never saw her again. For weeks, the young woman's sudden disappearance was investigated, but no real clues or evidence were discovered until 3 weeks after she vanished, on April 24th, when Kathy's body was pulled from Fox River. For decades, however, the case lay dormant. There was little information in Kathy's case. She had no known enemies and lived a perfectly ordinary and quiet life. It wasn't until 2020 that the case picked up a little steam again. North Aurora detectives re-examined the evidence in her case and sent it off for further testing. Investigators' hopes were subsequently raised when the DNA of 2 individuals were recovered from the evidence. However, the DNA sample was too degraded for further testing and profiling. Another 2 years passed before police had another crack at it. They discovered a box of evidence containing the 19-year-old's belongings and evidence that she regularly visited the shopping center she was heading to on the day she disappeared, in part because she worked there. The following year, the evidence was taken to a forensic lab in Florida so it could be tested with the more recently established MVAC tool. In August 2024, authorities received a report from the lab that the DNA present on Kathy's clothing was around 9.4 trillion times more likely to have originated from Bruce Lindahl. Bruce Lindahl was born in 1953 and lived a life of crime beginning in the early 70s. His criminal history included taping and recording others' phone calls in order to extort them, illegal possession of weapons, resisting arrest, and various charges of rape and assault. He is also a suspected serial killer. In January 2020, DNA evidence revealed that he was responsible for the murder and rape of 16-year-old Pamela Mora, whose body was discovered on January 12, 1976. She'd gone to a convenience store the previous night to buy a drink and never returned to her friend's house. Lindahl is also believed to be linked to the disappearance of 16-year-old Deborah McCall, who was last seen in Downers Grove, Illinois, on November 5, 1979. Photographs of young girls were discovered in his apartment, including one of a girl resembling Deborah. In 1980, Lindahl abducted 25-year-old Deborah Collender from the car park of a shopping center in Aurora. She was sexually assaulted by him at his apartment, but she managed to escape after he fell asleep. While she notified police and he was subsequently arrested, charges were dropped against him when Deborah vanished one day after work. As she was the key witness, the case against him fell apart. Deborah's body was found in 1982 in Oswego, Illinois. A man came forward shortly afterwards, stating that Lindahl had offered him money to kill Deborah because she was going to testify at his trial. Lindahl became the prime suspect in the case. Lindahl's last murder was that of 18-year-old Charles Chuck Huber Jr. On April 4, 1981, the pair played 10-pin bowling together, but Lindahl would later stab Chuck 28 times with a knife. During the assault, the killer accidentally cut himself in the thigh, severing his own femoral artery. This led Lindahl to bleed to death. Investigators determined that Kathy had been abducted by Lindahl in the car park of her apartment building. He then drove her to Fox River, where her body would later be found. Since Lindahl accidentally killed himself in 1981, authorities can't bring charges, but are satisfied that the case is closed. They've noted that Lindahl could be responsible for the murders of as many as 12 women and girls, as well as 9 rapes. Mary Tracy. On June 26, 1980, a construction crew working on Highway 55 discovered the body of a young woman near an irrigation ditch. Authorities who responded to the scene identified the victim as 25-year-old Mary Tracy, who'd gone missing just 2 days earlier from Garden City, Idaho. She was last seen walking along Chinden Boulevard, an area filled with bars and nightclubs, in which Mary was well known. Mary's autopsy showed that her end had been cruel and violent. She had been stabbed 11 times in various locations, including her leg, arm, chest, hand, and back, with the fatal injury puncturing her heart. She had also suffered blunt force trauma to the back of the head. A piece of newspaper dated 13 years earlier was found stuck to one side of her face, while there was a bloody fingerprint on her back. However, this evidence led nowhere, and the fingerprint could not be used for identification and comparison purposes. Mary's husband was quickly ruled out of the investigation, since he was in hospital at the time of her death. Door-to-door inquiries revealed that neighbors had seen the 25-year-old fighting with a man on a motorcycle on the day she disappeared, but without further information, the case grew cold. For decades, the case lay dormant, but in 2023, detectives with the Ada County Sheriff's Office began looking over old notes, files, and evidence. A sexual assault kit was also sent off for DNA testing, while witnesses and potential suspects alike were interviewed again. Finally, authorities settled on a primary suspect, Charles Nicholas Strain. A note in the case file suggested that Strain was involved because a jailhouse informant had stated that he'd seen Strain at a nightclub on June 24th. Strain told the informant that he'd killed a girl by stabbing her to death and throwing her in a ditch off the road. By all accounts, Strain was a career criminal and a violent man. In 1980, he was mostly responsible for a string of robberies and burglaries across multiple states, but in 1981, he abducted his 10-year-old daughter and fled to Arizona. For over 2 years, the little girl believed that her mother had died in a car crash until somebody recognized her as a missing person and called the police. 5 years later, in February of 1986, Strain was charged and convicted with the murder of his 16-year-old stepdaughter, Deanna Dean, who had gone missing in 1981. That year, Deanna had gone with Strain on a motorcycle trip from Idaho to Texas. She checked in regularly with her mother, calling several times a week before all contact suddenly ceased. When Strain returned, he told Deanna's mother that the teenager had stolen his money and fled. However, in October 1981, the skeletal remains of a teen girl were discovered under rocks in a steep ravine in Spanish Fork Canyon. She had been shot in the head and still carried an address book, which investigators used to try and identify the victim. The remains were positively identified when Deanna's mother was sent a letter by the police, looking to put a name to the remains. Strain confessed to the murder during questioning, and though he was asked about the slaying of Mary Tracy at this time, he claimed he didn't know anything about her or her death. Unfortunately, he died in 2007. However, investigators in 2023 were able to obtain a blood sample of his, which had been kept after his autopsy. Strain's DNA was a perfect match to the DNA discovered at Mary's crime scene. Though Mary's case is solved, there are still some unanswered questions. Investigators are interested in speaking with anyone who worked at the Sunline Motel during the summer of 1980. There is some speculation that Mary was killed here and moved afterwards, since there was little blood or evidence at the scene where her body was found. Furthermore, a maid at the motel in 1980 recalled cleaning up a lot of blood in one of the rooms around the time of her disappearance and death. Detectives would also like to locate and speak with a friend of Mary's known only as Lisa, as she may have been one of the last people to see the 25-year-old alive. Anyone with relevant information is asked to call the Ada County Sheriff's Office at 208-577-3102. And there you have the facts. Please leave a comment down below with your own thoughts and reactions, and remember to like this video and subscribe to support the channel. Thank you for watching. Stay alert, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.